You are sitting at the dinner table. Your parents, friends, or your partner are laughing, discussing politics, complaining about their boss, or obsessing over things that, for you, have completely lost their meaning. Physically, you are just inches apart. Energetically, you inhabit different galaxies. Why does the process of expanding consciousness and understanding the true nature of reality seem to demand such a high toll, the most absolute and silent loneliness? There is a silent mistake that 99% of people who awaken make, and it is exactly what is pushing you away from those you love. And the hardest part is this: no one else seems to notice. They think everything is normal, but inside you, something has shifted so deeply that you can't go back. Conversations feel empty. Reactions feel predictable. And you start asking yourself a question you didn't expect. Is this growth, or am I losing connection with everyone? Stay with me, because what feels like separation is not what it seems, and what you're about to understand can completely change the way you relate to the people you love. In physics, we know that everything is made of atoms, and that atoms are 99.9% empty space vibrating at specific frequencies. When your perception changes, your vibrational signature literally shifts. You begin to see the matrix of beliefs that trap society, and this is where the pain begins. You see the cage, but they only see the scenery. Do you know that terrible feeling of wanting to remove the blindfold from someone you love while they fight to keep it tightly in place? It doesn't feel like a theory when it happens. It feels personal. It feels like distance, like something invisible has stretched the space between you and the people who used to understand you without effort. Conversations that once flowed now stumble. Silences feel heavier. You listen, but something inside you no longer lands in the same way. This is what a frequency clash feels like in real life. Think of two radios tuned to different stations. They can sit right next to each other on the same table, but each one is receiving a completely different broadcast. One plays noise to the other. That's what starts happening when your perception shifts. It's not that you've become better, and it's not that they've become less. You are simply tuned to different layers of the same reality. Before, certain things made perfect sense. Worries, ambitions, conflicts, they felt solid, urgent, real. Now you start to see the patterns behind them. You notice how fear repeats itself, how opinions are recycled, how people defend ideas that hurt them. You're no longer just inside the experience, you're watching it. And that changes everything. Because while you are observing the structure, they are still fully immersed in it. For them, it's not a pattern, it's life, it's identity, it's survival. So when you speak from your new perspective, it doesn't sound like clarity to them. It sounds like threat. That's the part no one prepares you for. You think that seeing more clearly will bring you closer to people, that understanding will create connection. But instead, it often creates friction. Not because you're wrong, but because your way of seeing interrupts the stability of their world. And human beings protect their internal world fiercely. Their beliefs are not just ideas, they are anchors. They hold together their sense of meaning, their decisions, their past. So when you question those beliefs, even gently, it can feel to them like you're pulling at the foundation of who they are. That's why they resist. Not because they don't love you, not because they're closed-minded in some simple way, but because at a deeper level, your words are asking them to step into uncertainty. And uncertainty to the mind feels like danger. So they push back, they change the subject, they laugh it off. Sometimes they get irritated, sometimes they distance themselves. And you feel it immediately. You feel that subtle wall rising between you. You feel the disconnect in their eyes the moment where they stop meeting you where you are. And inside, something tightens. Because now you're not just seeing differently, you're feeling alone in what you see. This is where the confusion deepens, because part of you starts wondering if you're the one creating the distance, if maybe you should go back to how things were, if maybe it was easier when you didn't notice so much, but you can't unsee it. Once your perception shifts, it doesn't reverse. You can pretend, you can stay quiet, but internally, the awareness remains. It keeps observing. It keeps noticing the gaps, the loops, the emotional patterns playing out in front of you. And at the same time, something else starts to grow. A quiet urgency, a need to share what you're seeing, not to prove anything, but to help. Because when you care about someone, watching them suffer inside patterns you can now recognize feels almost unbearable. You want to reach in and say, "Look, you don't have to keep doing this. There's another way to see it." And that intention feels pure. It feels like love. But this is where a subtle shift begins, one that most people don't catch until it has already created distance. Because the moment you feel responsible for opening their eyes, the dynamic between you changes. Without realizing it, you stop just being with them and start trying to move them. And that's where the tension starts to build in a different way. Our first impulse when we discover the truth of the universe is to try to save others. We want to share videos, recommend books, debate. But there is something very dangerous in this attitude that almost no one notices. The more you try to pull someone toward the truth, the more their belief system hardens to protect itself. Physics teaches us the law of action and reaction. Your force of trying to free them creates an equal and opposite force of resistance. At first, it feels like care. You send a video that changed your perspective. You bring up a different way of seeing things during a conversation. You try to gently question their assumptions. In your mind, you're offering something valuable, something that could ease their suffering, open their awareness, maybe even bring them peace. But what you don't see right away is what they feel on the other side. They don't feel invited, they feel corrected. Even if your tone is calm, even if your intention is good, there is a subtle energy underneath it. I see something you don't. And that small gap is enough to trigger defense. Because now the conversation is no longer equal. It becomes a quiet struggle over who is right, who understands more, who is seeing reality clearly. And most of the time, this struggle is invisible on the surface. They might smile and nod. They might say, "That's interesting." But internally, something closes. A wall goes up. Not because they want to disconnect from you, but because they need to protect their sense of stability. Their worldview is the lens through which they make sense of everything. Relationships, choices, identity. When that lens is challenged, it doesn't feel like an idea being questioned. It feels like the ground shifting under their feet. So they hold tighter, and the more they hold tighter, the more you feel the need to explain better, to clarify, to try again in a different way. You think maybe you just haven't found the right words yet. Maybe if you say it more simply or use a better example or show them something undeniable, they'll finally see what you see. But this is where the trap deepens. Because now you're not just sharing, you're trying to convince. And the moment you cross into that space, the connection starts to weaken. Conversations lose their natural flow. You begin to anticipate resistance before it even happens. They begin to anticipate being challenged before you even speak. It becomes exhausting. You start noticing that certain topics create tension, that certain expressions on their face signal that familiar shutdown, and yet something inside you keeps pushing. Because you care. Because you don't want to watch them stay stuck in patterns that are so clear to you now. But there's a hidden assumption in that impulse. It assumes that they are ready. It assumes that seeing what you see would be helpful for them right now. It assumes that your timing is aligned with their process. And most importantly, it assumes that awakening is something that can be given from the outside. That's where the distortion lives. Because if you look closely, every moment of real clarity you've ever had didn't come because someone forced it into you. It came when something inside you became open enough to see differently. It was a shift that happened within, not something that was installed from the outside. And yet, without noticing, you begin trying to do exactly that to others, to install a new way of seeing. That's why it creates resistance. Not because truth is rejected, but because pressure is. There is a big difference between someone discovering something and someone being told something. Discovery expands. Pressure contracts. And most attempts to help carry more pressure than we realize. You can feel it if you're honest with yourself. That slight frustration when they don't understand. That quiet disappointment when they dismiss what matters to you. That urge to try again, just one more time, to get them to see it. That's not just love. There's control mixed into it. And this is the part that's uncomfortable to face. Because it challenges the image you have of your own intention. You want to believe you're just helping. But underneath that, There can be a need for validation, a need for them to meet you where you are so you don't feel alone in what you've seen. So the attempt to save them becomes, in a subtle way, an attempt to relieve your own discomfort. And they feel that. Not consciously, not in words, but energetically. It creates tension in the space between you. A pressure that makes them step back, even if they can't explain why. And the more they step back, the more the distance grows. Not because you stopped loving each other, but because the relationship is no longer resting on shared presence. It's being pulled by opposing forces, your desire to expand their view and their need to preserve their own. Over time, this starts to wear on both sides. You feel unheard. They feel pushed. You feel alone. They feel judged. And what began as an attempt to bring light into the relationship slowly turns into something heavier, something strained. And this is usually the moment where people start to feel a deeper kind of pain. Not just the frustration of being misunderstood, but the grief of realizing that the connection itself is changing. It hurts. It hurts to see your mother suffering over something that is just an illusion of her mind. It hurts to lose common ground with that childhood friend. It feels like the universe is breaking your connections. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that systems tend toward entropy, toward disorder. Your old relationships are collapsing not because you failed, but because the old structure cannot sustain your new level of energy. But have you really understood what awakening means? Because from where you stand right now, it can feel like loss. Not dramatic, not loud, but constant. Subtle fractures in conversations. Moments where you realize you no longer respond the way you used to. Jokes that don't land. Concerns that don't feel real to you anymore. And the hardest part is that nothing bad happened. No betrayal, no clear conflict, just a slow drift. Like two continents separating without anyone noticing the exact moment it began. You sit there listening, trying to reconnect with the version of yourself that used to belong effortlessly in those spaces. But something inside you stays still, almost like it refuses to go back, and that creates a quiet tension, because externally, everything looks the same people, the same places, the same routines, but internally, the experience is completely different. This is where the feeling of isolation deepens, not because you are physically alone, but because your inner world no longer matches the shared reality around you, and human connection at its core depends on shared meaning. When that meaning starts to dissolve, the connection doesn't break instantly, it thins out. And you feel it. You start choosing silence more often, not because you have nothing to say, but because what you would say doesn't seem to fit anymore. Or worse, it creates friction. So you adapt, you simplify, you stay on the surface just enough to keep things smooth. But inside, something feels unexpressed. And over time, that builds into a kind of emotional fatigue. You're present, but not fully. Connected, but not deeply. Seen, but not really understood. And that gap begins to feel like loneliness, even when you're surrounded by people who care about you. This is the entropy of relationships. Not an explosion, but a gradual loss of coherence. In physics, when a system loses energy, it becomes less ordered, less structured. The same thing happens here. The shared language that once held your relationships together starts to dissolve. The assumptions you used to agree on no longer align. The emotional rhythms fall out of sync, and without realizing it, you begin to grieve not just the people, but the version of the relationship that used to exist. The ease, the familiarity, the sense of being on the same page without effort. You miss that, even if you know you can't go back to it. And this is where a dangerous interpretation can form. You might start believing that awakening is the cause of separation, that seeing more clearly means losing connection. That growth requires distance or even isolation. Some people go further and begin to withdraw on purpose, thinking that being alone is a sign of evolution. But look closely. Is it really awakening that is creating this pain? Or is it the way you are relating to the change? Because there's something subtle happening beneath the surface. As your awareness expands, you're not just seeing others differently, you're also redefining yourself. You're letting go of old identities, old reactions, old ways of relating. And in that process, There is naturally a period where nothing feels stable. You're no longer who you were, but you're not fully grounded in who you're becoming either. And that in-between space can feel like disconnection from everything. It's easy in that space to look outward and assume that the problem is them, that they are too unconscious, too attached, too unaware. It gives a kind of explanation to the discomfort, a reason for why things no longer fit. But that explanation carries a hidden cost, because the moment you define others as asleep and yourself as awake, you create separation at a deeper level than any difference in perspective ever could. And this is where the process becomes even more complex, because what started as a genuine shift in awareness can quietly turn into something else. Something more rigid, more subtle, and in many ways more isolating than before. Not because you lost the truth, but because of how you begin to hold it. This is where most people get lost, and maybe you are falling into it right now. When you look at your family and think, they are asleep, I am awake, what are you feeding? Your ego. You replaced a materialistic ego with a spiritual one. You placed yourself on a pedestal of silent superiority. And you know what that does to your vibrational frequency? It drops back into the density of separation. Your judgment becomes the new cage of your own illusion. It doesn't look like ego at first. That's what makes it so hard to detect. It feels like clarity, like you've finally stepped out of confusion and can see things as they are. And compared to how you used to think, that might even be true. But then something subtle begins to grow alongside that clarity, a quiet sense of being different. Not just different, but ahead. You start noticing how others react emotionally, how they get caught in the same loops, how they defend ideas that don't serve them. And part of you observes this with awareness, but another part starts labeling it, measuring it, ranking it. Without saying it out loud, a sentence begins to repeat inside you. I wouldn't react like that anymore. And that sentence feels harmless, even accurate. But look closer at what it creates distance. Because the moment you place yourself on one side of a line and others on the opposite side, connection changes. You're no longer meeting them where they are. You're observing them from above, even if only slightly. And people feel that, even if you never say a word. It shows up in your tone, in your patience, in the way you listen. You become less curious and more interpretive. Instead of being present with them, you start analyzing them. Their words become examples. Their behavior becomes proof of what you already believe about their level of awareness. And this is where the paradox tightens. Because you think you've stepped out of illusion, but in reality you've entered a more refined one. The illusion of being the one who sees. The ego is still there. It just changed its language. Before it might have been about status, success, or control. Now it's about awareness, consciousness, and truth. But the structure is the same. It still separates, it still compares. It still needs a position to stand on. And the cost of that is subtle, but heavy. You start feeling alone, not just because others don't understand you, but because you've unconsciously stepped away from them. Not physically, but internally. You've created a gap that didn't need to exist. And then something even more complex happens. You begin to protect this new identity. Just like before when beliefs gave you stability, now this sense of being awake becomes something you hold on to. You defend it in quiet ways. You avoid situations that might challenge it. You gravitate toward ideas and people that reinforce it. And without noticing, your openness starts to narrow. You're no longer just observing reality. You're filtering it through a new layer, a spiritual lens that feels true, but still selects, still judges, still organizes the world into categories of aware and unaware. And that keeps the separation alive. This is why the feeling of isolation doesn't go away, even after all the insights. Because it's not only coming from external differences, it's being sustained internally through the way you relate to those differences. And if you're honest, there are moments where you can feel it. A slight impatience when someone complains about something you've moved beyond. A quiet frustration when conversations stay on the surface. A sense of disconnection that isn't just about them not seeing, but about you no longer fully entering their world. That's not freedom, that's a different kind of attachment. And the hardest part is that it can feel justified, because from your perspective, you're simply seeing more clearly. But clarity without humility turns into separation. It loses its softness, it stops connecting and starts dividing. So the question shifts, not are they awake or asleep, but what is happening inside me when I see them this way? Because that reaction, that sense of distance, that subtle judgment, is showing you something important. Not about them, but about where you still hold on to identity. And this is where the ground begins to move again. Because if the ego can exist even here, even dressed in awareness, then what you thought was the final step might not be the end of the path at all. It might be another layer to see through. And that realization can feel destabilizing, because now the certainty softens, the labels start to lose their weight. The clear division between those who know and those who don't begins to blur. And in that space, a different kind of understanding starts to emerge. One that doesn't place you above or below anyone, but right in the middle of the same field. What if I told you they are not wrong? In quantum mechanics, all probabilities exist simultaneously until they are observed. Your family, your friends, they are not behind. They are playing a perfect role, sustaining a frequency of contrast necessary for the universe to experience itself in all dimensions. They chose, at a deep soul level, to play the game of illusion to the end. Who are you to interrupt that experience? This idea can feel uncomfortable at first, because it removes the position you were starting to stand on. It takes away the sense that there is a clear direction where some are ahead and others are late. Instead, it suggests something much less linear and much more unsettling to the mind, that everything is happening exactly where it needs to happen, not as a fixed destiny, but as a dynamic field of possibilities. In quantum physics, before something is observed, it exists as a range of potential outcomes. It is not one thing yet. It is many things at once. Only when observation happens does one of those possibilities become real in that moment. Now bring that into your life. What you call awakening is not the final truth. It is one expression, one way reality is being observed through you. But the people around you are not failed versions of that truth. They are different expressions, holding other possibilities in place. And without those other possibilities, your experience wouldn't even exist in the way it does. Contrast is not a mistake. It is structure. Think about it in simple terms. You recognize clarity because confusion exists. You value peace because you have seen stress. You understand awareness because you have lived without it. The very thing that frustrates you in others is also what allows you to recognize what you now call truth. So what if they are not obstacles? What if they are part of the equation that makes your perception possible? This shifts something deep inside, because instead of seeing them as people who need to change, you begin to see them as people who are sustaining a different angle of the same reality. Not less valid, just different in function. And that challenges the idea that you need to fix anything. It also challenges the timeline you've been holding, the belief that everyone should eventually arrive where you are, in the way you arrived, at the speed you arrived. But reality doesn't organize itself like that. There is no single sequence that everyone follows, no universal schedule of realization. Some people question everything early. Others stay within familiar structures their entire lives. And neither path is an error in the system. They are variations within it. The mind wants to organize this into progress, into levels, into movement towards something higher. But the deeper you look, the more that idea starts to dissolve. Because what you're actually seeing is not a ladder, it's a field where multiple states of awareness coexist at the same time, each one contributing to the whole. And here's where it becomes personal again. If they are playing their role perfectly, then your frustration is not about them being wrong. It's about your resistance to their role. That changes the focus completely, because now the tension you feel is no longer something they are causing. It's something arising in you in response to what they represent. Their way of seeing the world is pressing against something inside you that is not fully at ease yet. And that's important, because it means this is not just about understanding them. It's about understanding your reaction to them. The discomfort, the urgency, the need to shift their perspective, these are signals, not of their limitation, but of something still unresolved in you. And this is where the idea of control starts to fall apart. Because if reality is this interconnected field of possibilities, then trying to force one part of it to change misses the bigger picture. You're not standing outside the system, adjusting it. You are inside it, interacting with it, influencing it in ways that are far more subtle than direct action. And those subtle ways don't come from pressure. They come from coherence, from how aligned you are internally, from how much tension you carry or release when faced with difference, from whether your presence creates space or resistance. This is a different kind of responsibility. Not the responsibility to change others, but the responsibility to see clearly without distorting what you see through judgment or urgency. And as that understanding starts to settle, something softens, because the need to correct begins to lose its intensity. The idea that something is wrong starts to dissolve, and in its place a quieter question emerges. If you are already connected within this field, if separation is not as real as it feels, then what is actually happening between you and the people you love beneath all these differences? Albert Einstein called quantum entanglement spooky action at a distance. When two particles interact, they become connected forever. What happens to one affects the other instantly, even across the universe. You don't need to convince your family of anything. You are entangled. By healing yourself, raising your own frequency, and finding peace in chaos, you alter the energetic fabric of your entire lineage. You change them without saying a word. This is not just a poetic idea. It explains something you've already felt, but maybe couldn't name. Think about how a single person's mood can shift an entire room. No explanation, no argument, just presence. Someone walks in tense, and suddenly, everyone feels it. Someone else is calm, grounded, and without trying, the atmosphere softens. Nothing visible is exchanged, yet something real moves between people. Now imagine that connection, not just in a room, but across time, across shared history, across years of emotional bonds, memories, and silent understandings. That's the level where your relationships actually live. You are not just connected by conversations or shared opinions. You are connected by something much deeper. Patterns of emotion, ways of responding, inherited reactions, unspoken agreements about how to deal with life. These patterns run quietly in the background, shaping how you and your family interact without anyone needing to explain them. And when you begin to change internally, those patterns start to shift, not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but subtly, consistently. If you become less reactive, something in the dynamic changes. If you stop feeding certain types of conversations, they begin to lose energy. If you bring more patience into moments that used to trigger you, the usual outcome doesn't happen the same way anymore. At first, it might seem like nothing is happening. But look closer. The argument that would normally escalate pauses. The tension that used to build dissipates faster. The person who always expected a certain reaction from you starts to hesitate, because that version of you is no longer there in the same way. This is influence without force. And it's far more powerful than anything you can explain with words. Because words meet the surface of someone's mind, but your state meets their entire system. It interacts with their emotions, their expectations, their unconscious patterns. It reaches places that logic can't access. That's why trying to convince rarely works, but being different always does. When you shift, you create a new reference point inside the relationship, something unfamiliar but stable. And over time, people begin to adjust to that new reference, even if they don't understand it. They may not call it awareness, they may not describe it in the same language you use, but they feel it. And feeling is what changes people. Not instantly, not on command, but gradually, in their own time, in their own way. This also removes a weight you may not have realized you were carrying. The weight of responsibility. The idea that it's your job to wake them up, to guide them, to show them something they can't yet see. That weight creates pressure, and pressure creates tension, and tension disrupts the very connection that allows real change to happen. But when you understand entanglement, that pressure starts to fall away, because you see that the connection is already there. It doesn't need to be created or forced. It's active, whether you interfere with it or not. The only question is what you are contributing to it. Are you feeding it with frustration, urgency, and silent judgment, or are you feeding it with steadiness, openness, and a kind of quiet trust? This is where your attention turns inward in a different way. Not as a retreat, but as a form of participation, because every time you choose to respond differently, to remain present instead of reactive, to listen without needing to correct. You are changing the field you share with them. You are introducing a different kind of signal into the system, and systems respond to signals. Not always immediately, not always in ways you can track step by step, but they do respond. Over time, patterns reorganize, dynamics shift. What felt fixed begins to loosen, and this happens without confrontation, without the need to break anything apart, just through consistency, through being aligned with what you see without needing others to match you in order for you to remain steady. That's what makes the change real. That's what makes it sustainable. And slowly, something else begins to emerge, a different kind of connection, not based on agreeing about everything, not based on sharing the same perspective, but based on something quieter, a sense that even in the differences there is still a link, still a relationship that is alive, still moving, still responsive in ways that go beyond words. And when you start to trust that connection, you stop trying to control how it unfolds. You begin to show up differently, not as someone who needs to change the people you love, but as someone who understands the power of simply being present in a new way. And that's where a very practical question begins to form. If your presence has this kind of impact, if the way you observe and respond is already shaping the dynamic, then how do you actually move through everyday moments without losing that stability? So how do you survive the next Sunday lunch? By using the observer effect. An electron only behaves like matter when it is being measured or intensely observed. When the people you love enter drama, gossip, or fear, don't participate, but don't judge either. Be the compassionate observer. The empty space. When you offer no friction, their negativity has nowhere to anchor. This sounds simple, but in practice, it asks for something very different from what you're used to. Because normally, when a conversation starts to pull you in, when someone complains, criticizes, or brings tension, you feel a subtle pressure to respond, to agree, to disagree, to add something, to correct something. Participation feels automatic, almost like silence would be strange or even rude. But look closely at what usually happens when you engage. If you agree, you reinforce the emotional state. If you disagree, you create resistance. If you try to fix it, you introduce tension. In all cases, you become part of the dynamic that keeps the pattern alive. The observer effect invites you into a different position. Not outside the moment, not disconnected, but not entangled in the reaction either. You're there, fully present, listening, aware, but without feeding the emotional charge that is being expressed. You don't absorb it and you don't push against it. You allow it to exist without giving it more structure. At first, this can feel unnatural. You might worry that you're being passive or that you're holding back something that should be said. But this isn't about suppressing yourself. It's about choosing the quality of your presence instead of reacting automatically. There's a big difference between silence that comes from avoidance and silence that comes from clarity. One is tense, the other is stable. People can feel that difference, even if they don't consciously understand it. When you are internally reactive but externally quiet, the tension is still there. It leaks through your body language, your eyes, your timing. But when you are truly observing, when there is no inner resistance, no need to change what's happening, something shifts in the space. The energy of the interaction starts to lose intensity. It's like removing fuel from a fire. The fire doesn't go out instantly, but it stops growing. Without new input, it begins to settle on its own. And this is where things become interesting, because people are used to certain responses from you. They expect you to react in familiar ways. They expect agreement, disagreement, or engagement. When those responses don't come, it creates a small pause in their pattern. A moment where something doesn't unfold the way it usually does. They might repeat themselves, trying to pull you in. They might look for validation. But if your presence remains steady, not cold, not distant, just open and calm, the pattern starts to lose its grip. And sometimes, without you saying anything, the conversation shifts. Not dramatically, not always in a visible way, but enough to change the direction. The intensity drops, the topic softens, or the person simply moves on. This is the practical side of what you've been sensing. You don't need to correct every illusion you see. You don't need to fix every emotional reaction around you. By not reinforcing it, you are already influencing it. But there is an important detail here. Observing is not the same as withdrawing. You're not leaving the interaction, you're still there. You can still respond, but your responses come from a different place. If you speak, it's not to control the outcome, but to express something clean, something that doesn't carry hidden tension. A simple sentence, said without emotional charge, can have more impact than a long explanation filled with urgency. And sometimes, the most powerful response is a question, not a question that challenges, but one that opens space, something that gently invites reflection without forcing it. Because the goal is not to lead them somewhere, it's to create an environment where something new can appear, if they are ready. And if they are not, that's okay too. This approach protects your energy in a very real way, because you're no longer being pulled into every emotional wave around you. You're no longer carrying conversations after they end, replaying them in your mind, thinking about what you should have said differently. You remain centered, and from that center, your presence becomes consistent. Not perfect, not unshakable, but much less reactive than before. And that consistency is what slowly reshapes the way others relate to you. Over time, people may start bringing different kinds of conversations to you, or they may simply feel more at ease around you without knowing why. The relationship doesn't have to break just because your awareness changed. It can reorganize, but this requires patience, because you are no longer forcing change, you are allowing it, and allowing takes time. It asks you to trust processes that are not always visible, to stay grounded even when nothing seems to be happening on the surface. And in that space, something deeper begins to reveal itself. Because when you stop reacting, when you stop trying to control or fix what others are doing, you start to see them differently. Not as problems to solve, not as people who need to wake up, but as something else entirely. Something that might have a purpose you haven't fully understood yet. Think about it. A movie doesn't work if the lights are on. Illusion, what the ancients called Maya, is the screen where the light of your consciousness can be projected. Your partner's stubbornness, your friend's materialism. They are the dark scenarios that allow your light to be visible. They are making a cosmic sacrifice so you can understand what love truly is. At first, this idea can feel almost offensive to the part of you that still wants things to be different. Because when you see someone you love struggling, reacting, or repeating the same patterns, your instinct is not to see beauty in it. Your instinct is to fix it, to soften it, to bring light into it. But what if the contrast itself is part of the design? A story only moves because there is tension. A painting only gains depth because of shadow. Without contrast, everything becomes flat, indistinguishable, almost invisible. In the same way, your ability to recognize patience, clarity, and compassion doesn't emerge in isolation. It emerges in response to something that challenges it. So when someone close to you acts in a way that feels unconscious, it's not just an inconvenience in your path, it's a condition that reveals your state. Not in theory, but in real time. You don't discover your level of awareness when everything is calm and aligned. You discover it in the exact moment when someone says something that used to trigger you, and you notice what happens inside. Do you tighten? Do you react? Do you withdraw? Or do you remain open? That moment is the real measure. And suddenly, the situation changes meaning. It's no longer just about them being stuck in something. It becomes a mirror, reflecting where you still get pulled, where you still resist, where you still expect reality to behave differently so you can feel at peace. This is where temporary blindness starts to look different. Not as a flaw, but as a function, because if everyone around you saw exactly what you see, acted exactly how you act, and responded with the same level of awareness, there would be nothing to challenge your state, nothing to reveal where your understanding is still fragile. Everything would feel easy, but also empty. Growth requires friction. Not constant struggle, not unnecessary pain, but enough contrast to keep your awareness alive, responsive, and grounded. Without that, what you call awakening could easily turn into something static, an idea you hold rather than a way you live. And the people around you provide that friction naturally. Not because they are trying to teach you, not because they are consciously playing a role, but because their way of being interacts with yours in a way that reveals what is still active inside you. This doesn't mean you should accept harmful behavior or ignore real problems. It means you begin to see beyond the surface of what is happening. You stop reducing people to their reactions, and you start recognizing the role those reactions play in your own experience. And something softens. Because instead of seeing them as obstacles, you begin to see them as part of a larger movement, one that includes you as much as it includes them. There is also a quiet humility that grows here. Because if their blindness serves a purpose in your awareness, then your awareness might also be serving a purpose you don't fully understand yet. It removes the need to rank experiences, to decide what is higher or lower, better or worse. Everything becomes part of the same unfolding. And from that place, your relationship with others begins to change again. You stop waiting for them to become different so you can feel connected. You stop measuring the quality of the relationship based on how aligned their thinking is with yours. Instead, you start noticing something else, the simple fact that they are here, that they exist in your life, with their own way of seeing, their own patterns, their own timing, and that somehow your paths intersect. That alone begins to feel meaningful, not because everything is perfect, but because it doesn't need to be. And this is where love starts to take on a different shape, less conditional, less dependent on agreement, less tied to shared perspectives. It becomes something that can exist even in the presence of difference, even in the presence of misunderstanding. But for that to stabilize, something in you has to stop trying to adjust the scene. Because as long as you are trying to rewrite the roles of the people around you, you remain in tension with what is, and tension keeps you from fully embodying the very clarity you've been discovering. So the movement shifts again, away from trying to change the script and toward something quieter but far more powerful, toward becoming the kind of presence that doesn't need the scene to change in order to remain steady within it. Physics teaches us that bodies with greater mass create a gravitational field, attracting what surrounds them not through effort, but simply by existing. Do you know the mental exhaustion of trying to explain your beliefs and not being heard? Stop pushing. Instead of being a force that collides, become a center of gravity. When you abandon the need to convince them and start living your truth with real, unshakable peace, you create a field of attraction. People don't awaken through words they hear, but through the energy they feel. This changes the entire strategy. Because up until now, a part of you may have believed that clarity needs to be expressed, explained, defended. That if something is true, it should be shared in a way that others can understand. And when that doesn't happen, it creates frustration, a sense that something important is being missed. But gravity doesn't argue. It doesn't persuade. It doesn't chase. It doesn't explain itself. It simply holds a stable presence, and everything around it adjusts in response to that stability. That's the shift, from effort to embodiment. Instead of asking, how do I make them see? The question becomes, how stable am I in what I see? Because instability is what creates the urge to convince. When something is not fully integrated inside you, you look for confirmation outside. You try to align others with your view so you can feel grounded in it. But when something is truly settled within you, that need disappears. You don't feel the same urgency to explain, not because you're hiding anything, but because your state is no longer dependent on their agreement. You can sit in the same conversation, hear completely different perspectives, and remain steady without needing to correct or defend. That steadiness is what people feel, and it's different from detachment. Detachment can feel cold, distant, disconnected. Gravity feels present, warm but unmoved, open but not pulled. It allows others to be exactly as they are without losing its own center. This is where influence becomes quiet, but real. Because when someone is around you and notices that you don't react the way you used to, it creates curiosity. When they see that certain things no longer disturb you, it creates a question in their mind. Not always conscious, not always immediate, but something begins to register. They might not ask you directly. In fact, most of the time they won't. But they observe, they notice how you handle stress, how you respond to tension, how you carry yourself in situations that used to affect you. And slowly, without any formal conversation, a new reference point forms in their perception. Not something you told them, something they felt. And this is why trying to accelerate the process through explanation often backfires, because it replaces something organic with something forced. It turns a natural shift into a debate, and debates rarely change people at a deep level. They only reinforce positions. But presence doesn't create opposition, it creates space. And in that space, people can begin to see things on their own, without feeling pushed, without needing to defend themselves, without feeling like they are being evaluated. This is what makes the change sustainable, because it belongs to them. It's not something they adopted to match you. It's something that emerged within them, in their own timing, through their own observation. And when change happens that way, it holds. But this requires trust, not in them, but in the process itself. Trust that you don't need to manage their path, that you don't need to monitor their progress, that your role is not to guide them step by step, but to remain aligned in your own state consistently enough that it becomes a stable reference in the shared space. And consistency matters here more than intensity. It's not about having moments of perfect clarity followed by periods of reactivity. It's about gradually becoming more steady, more grounded, more present across different situations, so that your way of being is not something occasional, but something reliable. That reliability is what creates weight, and weight is what creates attraction. Over time, you may notice subtle shifts, a different kind of question, a slightly more open conversation, a moment where they pause instead of reacting. These are small changes, but they are real, and they don't come from what you said. They come from what you became, and at the same time, something else happens inside you. The exhaustion fades, because you're no longer carrying the responsibility of changing anyone. You're no longer trying to manage outcomes or control how others perceive reality. That constant effort, the one that drained you, that created tension in conversations, that made you feel unseen, begins to dissolve. In its place, there is a quieter kind of confidence. Not loud, not performative, but grounded. You can be in the same environments, around the same people, and feel less affected by what used to pull you. Not because you built walls, but because you developed a center. And from that center, something becomes possible that didn't exist before. You can return to those same moments, the same table, the same conversations, and experience them in a completely different way. The true level of spiritual mastery is not moving to the top of a mountain to escape low frequencies. It is being able to sit at that same dinner table from the beginning of the video, hear the complaints, and instead of feeling isolated, feel an overflowing love, simply because those people exist. Truth does not separate you from people. Truth reveals that both you and them are made of the exact same stardust experiencing time. At first, this sounds almost impossible, because the version of you that started this journey associates truth with distance, with seeing through things, stepping back, no longer getting involved in what feels unconscious or repetitive. And in many ways, that phase was necessary. It helped you break patterns, question assumptions, and see beyond what you used to accept without thinking. But that was not the destination. It was a transition. Real awakening doesn't end in separation. It moves through it. There comes a point where clarity is no longer something you use to distance yourself from others, but something that allows you to be with them more fully, without being pulled out of yourself. You stop needing the environment to match your state in order to feel at peace. And that changes everything, because now when someone complains, you don't immediately feel the urge to fix it or escape it. You hear it, but it doesn't hook into you the same way. When someone reacts emotionally, you don't shrink or tense up. You notice it, but you remain open, and in that openness, something unexpected appears. Warmth. Not because the situation is ideal, but because your resistance is gone. You're no longer silently arguing with what is happening. You're not wishing they were different in that moment. You're simply there, allowing them to be as they are, without losing yourself. That's what creates real connection again. Not shared beliefs, not perfect alignment, but presence without resistance. You begin to see them differently. Not as people who are stuck, not as people who need to wake up, but as expressions of life moving through their own path, just as you are. Their reactions, their fears, their habits, They stop being things you need to change and start being things you can witness with a kind of quiet understanding. And from that place, compassion becomes natural, not forced, not something you try to practice, but something that emerges when judgment fades, because when you're no longer placing yourself above them, you can finally meet them again, eye to eye. There is also a deep relief in this, because maintaining a position, whether it's I know or I see more clearly, takes energy. Even if it's subtle, it creates tension, a constant comparison between your state and theirs, a quiet effort to stay in that identity. But when that drops, you don't have to hold anything anymore. You don't have to be the one who understands. You don't have to be the one who stays aware. You're just present, human, responsive, open. And in that, something more real starts to take shape. You can laugh again without analyzing everything. You can listen without preparing a response. You can sit in silence without feeling the need to fill it. These simple things return, but they feel different now, lighter, less loaded, because they're no longer filtered through a need to interpret or correct, and the feeling of loneliness begins to dissolve, not because others changed, but because you're no longer creating distance inside yourself. The gap that once felt so real starts to close, not by bringing them to your level, but by releasing the idea that there were levels to begin with. There are still differences, of course. You will still notice patterns. You will still see things others don't see. But those differences no longer carry the same emotional weight. They don't isolate you. They simply exist, like different perspectives in the same landscape. And in that landscape, you're no longer standing apart. You're part of it again, fully. This is where truth becomes something lived, not something observed from a distance. It's no longer about identifying illusion everywhere you look. It's about being so grounded in your own clarity that illusion doesn't disturb you the same way. It loses its power to separate. And in that space, something very simple but very profound becomes clear. You were never actually disconnected from the people you love. You were only disconnected from the way they were. The loneliness of truth is not a punishment. It is a rite of passage. The pain you feel is not their separation, but your own resistance to accepting each person's level of evolution. The universe trusts you to anchor this light in silence. Stop trying to wake them up and start loving them exactly where they are. Because when the illusion finally falls, the only thing that will remain, the only real physics of the entire cosmos, is unity. And maybe now you can feel it. You were never truly alone. You were just learning how to stand without needing others to see what you see. Let this be simple. The next time you sit with them, don't try to change anything. Just be there, fully. If you made it this far, write in the comments, "I choose to be the calm presence." I'll know you stayed until the end, and if this connected with you, watch one of the videos on your screen right now. There's more waiting for you.